Hi, everybody. My name is Scott Gayfield. I'm a medical student at the University of Toledo, and today I'm going to share with you a little bit about the cell, and we'll talk about why it's so important in everything that's alive. So, the first thing we're going to look at is just a human, and this can be anything that's alive, it could be even your dog or a cat. And now we're going to take the human and we're just going to zoom in on a little part. And here we'll find an organ. So the human body is made up of a collection of organs. Here we have depicted the liver. So now we're going to zoom in a little bit closer. So if we zoom in to the organ, we'll find there is tissue. So now we can start seeing these little rectangles. Those are actually our little cells, but this tissue is just a collection of cells. And finally, if we zoom in one last time to this tissue, so we'll just take one little rectangle, zoom into it, that is one cell. So we'll see a collection of cells with these little dots in it called the nucleus, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. And so now I'm just going to take a second to label everything that we have talked about so far. Now finally, just one last review. We see on the left side we have a human, and that is made up of organs, which is made up of tissue, and that is all made up of cells. So overall, cells make up everything that is alive. So now that we have seen kind of what cells are and how they're the smallest form of life, now we can talk about why they're so important. So the first reason they're so important is nutrition. Cells are really important in absorbing all the food we eat, and that's why we need to fuel ourselves with things like food and water. Cells are able to use that and give us energy so that we're able, to go run, jump, and play. The next reason cells are so important is because of replication. So we know that as we grow older, we get bigger. So a little baby is able to grow into a kid, and then they're able to grow into an adult. And that is all because cells are able to reproduce themselves. So we see on the left side, we have one smiley face. That's just one cell. And the cell is essentially able to clone itself. So it goes through a really cool process that we'll kind of talk about later. And it's able to replicate itself so that we get two smiley faces or two cells. And it's able to do that a lot of times. And as a result of that, we're able to do things like grow and change over time. The final reason I'll mention for cells being so important is teamwork. Cells are able to work together to make bigger and cooler things. All living things are made of cells, just kind of like we talked about in that first introduction part. Cells are able to make up tissue, those make up organs, and that makes up a human. So everything that's alive, no matter how small or big it is made entirely of cells, and that's because they're able to work together as a team. So, on a similar note, where are cells found? Well, cells are found everywhere. So, you and I, humans, are all made of cells. All dogs and cats are made of cells. Even the plants outside, so flowers, grass, trees, everything is made of cells. Cells are the smallest part of life, and they're able to work together again with teamwork to make really large things. So humans like you and I are made of over 30 trillion cells, which is a lot of cells working together. So if cells are so small, how do we look at them? Well, the most common way of looking at cells is a microscope. So we see a light microscope here on the left side. You may have seen one like this before. There's also cool microscopes like electron microscopes that can see really close details of cells that we'll get to see in just the next coming slide. And an example of looking at some cells of what you could see under a light microscope is seen on the right. So this is actually a picture of blood on a light microscope. So we see these little red circles kind of floating around. Those are the red blood cells. So just another look of some things that you can see under microscopes. Neither one of the things I have here are actually cells. On the left side, we have a virus. It is not a cell, and whether viruses are alive or dead is a big debate in science. But nevertheless, viruses can take on a lot of really cool shapes and have different sizes, so they're interesting to look at. And then on the right side, we have probably my favorite animal ever. It's a really, really small animal that you can only see under a microscope, and it is called a tardigrade or a water bear. And these water bears have, you can see the little legs they have, kind of makes it look like a bear, and they can live in really cool environments like space. These are just a couple examples of cool things that scientists can look at under microscopes. So there are two primary types of cells. We'll talk a little bit about what makes up the cell in a little bit, but for right now, there are two types of cells. There are eukaryotes and prokaryotes. So eukaryotes are on the left. They are more complex. They can make multicellular organisms. So you and I are made primarily of eukaryotic cells. These cells also have a nucleus, which contains the DNA that makes up you and I. And they also have membrane-bound organelles. And these serve a lot of important functions that we'll kind of talk about in a little bit. And then because eukaryotic cells are what make up multicellular organisms, plants and animals and humans, most of the big things that you think of as being alive are made up of eukaryotic cells. So now if we look at the right side of the screen, we'll talk a little bit about prokaryotic cells. So in general, prokaryotic cells are what people call more simple. They are still very complex, but compared to eukaryotic cells, they are relatively more simple. So some examples of this is they only make unicellular organisms or single cellular organisms. So that means that people like you and I that are made of over 30 trillion cells are not made up of prokaryotes. We are made up of eukaryotes, as we previously discussed. They also do not have a nucleus, so their DNA and genetic information kind of floats around in a nucleoid, as you can see on the right side. And then they don't have any membrane-bound organelles. And so they can't do as many complex things as eukaryotic cells can. Some examples of prokaryotic cells are the most simple forms of life, including bacteria and archaea. In addition to there being many types of cells, we also have different types of organisms. So we can break these down into unicellular organisms or multicellular organisms. So unicellular organisms on the left side is a fancy way of saying one cell organisms. So these are able to work alone. They are usually prokaryotic and can also be eukaryotic cells. And the most common example you think of are bacteria. And then on the right side, we'll look at multicellular organisms. So these are many cells using teamwork to work together, and they are eukaryotic cells. And examples of this are you and I, and things like dogs, and this cat right here on the right side. So now I'm going to do my best here to draw the cell so that we can look at the different parts that make up the complex system of the cell. So the first thing we're going to look at is this big black line around everything, and this is the cell membrane. The cell membrane is essentially the wall that holds everything in the cell together. Next is the cytoplasm. So everything in white that's inside the cell membrane is called the cytoplasm. And if you think of it like a pool, it's essentially the water. It's where everything kind of floats around. The next part here in the middle is the big green dot, and this is called the nucleus. The nucleus is really important. It is the brain of the cell. It kind of controls everything and tells everything what it needs to do. And then if we look inside the nucleus, we see these gray X's, and these X's are chromosomes or DNA. And DNA is the instruction manual of our body and all of the cells in our body. So we get DNA from our parents, and it controls everything about us. And now we're going to look at one of these yellow circles that we see, and this is called mitochondria, which is commonly known as the powerhouse of the cell. It gives the cell energy so that we can do things like run, jump, and play. We also see that there's a lot of these yellow dots around the cell, and that's because our bodies require a lot of energy to live. And now if we look at the purple thing on the left side of the cell, this is called the Golgi body. And I think of the Golgi body a lot like the post office or the mailman. The cell is constantly making new things like proteins. And what the Golgi body does is it takes these proteins, it can modify them, and then it can package them and then take it to wherever it needs to go in the cell. And now if we look at the orange line on the left side of the screen, this is called the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, or ER for short. And this is responsible for making things like steroids in the cell, and it also helps protect us from harmful things. And on the right side, we see something pretty similar. It's another orange line, but it has these blue dots on it. So if we circle the blue dots, these are called ribosomes. And ribosomes will float throughout the cell, but they can also attach to another endoplasmic reticulum called the rough endoplasmic reticulum. And these ribosomes will make proteins, so they're kind of like the factories of the cell. And the last thing we're going to look at is this blue dot in the bottom right hand corner, and this is called the lysosome. And the lysosome is responsible for destroying things in the cell when it's done. So when the cell doesn't need proteins anymore, those will be sent to the lysosome and the lysosome will destroy it. And now that our cell is fully drawn, we can do a little activity called Cell City. So this is where we are going to take each part of the cell and then we're going to label it with the job it would do in a city. So the first example we'll look at is a cell membrane. So the cell membrane is a lot like the fence of a city. It keeps everything together, and very similar to a fence actually, the cell membrane has these little gates. So things in general cannot leave the cell membrane or enter the cell membrane, but there are little gates that allow small things to enter and leave the cell membrane. The next example I have drawn here is a cytoplasm. So as I said before, the cytoplasm was kind of like a pool of water. It's where everything floats around. So if we think of the cytoplasm kind of surrounding everything, I like to think of the cytoplasm as just being the air of the city. So the next thing I have drawn here is the nucleus, and the nucleus is a lot like City Hall. And the reason for that is because the City Hall is what makes the rules of the city, and the nucleus tells the cell what to do. So I like to think of the nucleus as the City Hall, or kind of the brain of the cell. Then within the nucleus we have the DNA, or the chromosomes, and the DNA is very similar to the library. It's kind of the instruction manual of the cell, and it tells the nucleus in the cell what to do. And now we have the mitochondria, and the mitochondria is what gives the cell energy, like we said before. So if the mitochondria is what provides the cell energy, it's a lot like the power plant, because it provides the cell the energy it needs to function without getting tired. Now we have the blue dots, which are the ribosomes, and the ribosomes typically function to make proteins, so the ribosomes are a lot like a factory. And while there are many ribosomes found floating throughout the cytoplasm, there's also some stuck to the rough endoplasmic reticulum, or the rough ER, kind of like we talked about earlier. So now if we take a look at the rough ER, I like to think of the rough ER kind of like a road, because once the ribosomes on the rough ER finish making their proteins, the rough ER will take those proteins and send them to the Golgi body so that they can be modified, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. But first we're going to talk about the smooth ER because it's very similar to the rough ER, except it doesn't have the little blue dots, it doesn't have the ribosomes. So what the smooth ER does is it makes another type of molecule in the cell called steroids, and these steroids are also sent to the Golgi body after they're made in the smooth ER, so that the Golgi body can modify them as they need to. So now we can talk about the Golgi body, and the Golgi body is a lot like the post office or the mailman of the cell. When the ribosomes and the rough ER and the smooth ER send their packages to the Golgi body can change it, and it can also put them in bigger packages and then send them to where they need to go based on where the nucleus wants it to go. So in that way, the Golgi body is a lot like the mailman or the post office. It delivers the packages across the cell. And lastly, we will look at the lysosome in the bottom right-hand corner. So the lysosome is kind of like the recycling or the garbage plant of the cell. It's where things go to be thrown away or recycled within the cell. So it's a way for the cell to get rid of waste that it doesn't want anymore. Alright, and that is it for the drawing. So here is a little summary of what we talked about of the different parts of the cell. So on the left-hand side, we have the structures that we talked about. In the middle, we have the job that structure had. And on the right side, I labeled what we had for our cell city, or what it would be if it were a city. So I hope you find this useful in being able to look at the cell. And now we are starting to wrap up the video, but I wanted to go ahead and look at a couple small things that I will probably make a video about in the future. So the first one is a difference between animal and plant cells. So animals and plants are both made of eukaryotic cells, but the types of cells within each are different, and they differ in the way that they make energy, and they also have different cell walls and cell membranes. So there's a lot of really cool differences. I labeled some of them here for you to look at, but again, I'm going to make a video about this in the future, so stay tuned. So one last topic I wanted to look at before we are done is cell replication. And as I talked about in the beginning of the video, being able to replicate is really important for a cell because it's what allows us to grow. So I'm going to be doing a video about this in the future, but you can kind of see what happens here. The cell is able to take the chromosomes or the DNA within the nucleus, and then it doubles them, and then it splits into two so that it can clone itself. It's a really cool process, so I'm excited to talk about it in the future. Lastly, I just wanted to say that I do not own any of the pictures that are in here that I did not draw myself. So here are the sites that I obtained each of the pictures from, as well as the source number that I have listed next to each of the pictures. Alright, thank you for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed learning about the cell today, and I hope that you are excited to learn more about the cell in the future.